Imagine this. It's 1918. Europe is fractured by war. The Spanish flu is raging across the globe, and after you barely survive influenza, delirium creeps in. Over the next day, you're burdened with involuntary movements in your eyes and an overwhelming desire to sleep for extended periods. When seeking treatment, you're lumped in with hundreds of others, some twitching and seemingly almost dancing uncontrollably. Others turned completely into living statues. A third of the people around you die. Although you are lucky enough to recover, no one can give you any solid answers about what you all just went through. Today we are reviewing the biggest medical mystery of the 20th century, the sleeping sickness known as encephalitis lethargica. Although it killed hundreds of thousands of people, we don't know what caused it or how to treat it. Encephalitis lethargica, I'll shorten it to EL for simplicity, rapidly developed into an epidemic in Italy in 1916. Similarly to the Spanish flu, it's believed that because of troop movements during World War I, it was able to quickly spread across not only Europe, but around the world. The Spanish flu vastly overshadowed EL. Even high estimates of EL are 100 times less deadly than the 1918 influenza pandemic, commonly called the Spanish flu. Since they both happened at the same time, some have theorized that influenza might have led to patients developing EL, especially since flu-like symptoms would always present before any other acute symptoms of EL. However, we'll touch on potential causes later in this video. EL is estimated to have affected over 1 million people worldwide between 1916 and 1931, a third of which would die. Another third would go on to develop chronic conditions. Usually, diseases affect the very old and the very young the worst, but oddly enough, EL mainly affected people between 10 to 45 years old. There are two phases of EL, the acute phase and the chronic phase. The acute phase, described in the intro, is the short period at the start of the illness, which has many different forms. Dr. Constantine von Economo, one of the leading doctors studying the illness during the epidemic period in Italy, classified it into 3 main groups. The somnolent ophthalmoplegic form was the most common, with the highest mortality rate at over 50%. However, fewer survivors experienced chronic conditions. Patients would feel dazed, confused, and delirious. They would experience abnormalities and uncontrolled movements of their pupils. And the main indicator is an intense desire to sleep for excessive amounts of time, though they were often aware of their surroundings during their sleep-like states. This, you might remember, is what you, as a hypothetical patient, experienced. The hyperkinetic form initially presented with a manic phase, where patients experienced involuntary vocalizations, twitching, including in the eyes and face, and dance-like movements. This would be followed by a hypomanic phase that was characterized by nerve pain in the face and limbs, visual and tactile hallucinations, and the reversal of day-night sleep cycles. Lastly, there is the homeostatic akinetic form, which was the least common, but certainly the most interesting. These patients were basically living statues. Their bodies were rigid with very minimal movement, if any. They often experienced waxy flexibility, meaning the rigidity could be overcome with slight external force. Although recovery from this form could sometimes last months, patients generally remained mentally intact. As stated earlier, the chronic phase of EL affected a third of patients, typically developing 1 to 5 years after the acute phase, but could follow directly after or even decades later. One case described the onset of chronic conditions 45 years after the patient had experienced the acute phase. During this time, patients suffered from Parkinsonism, sleep disturbances, eye movement abnormalities, involuntary movements, speech and respiratory abnormalities, jerks, twitching, spasms, tics affecting the mouth, and psychiatric disorders. It's estimated that in the decades after the epidemic, 50% of Parkinsonism cases were post-encephalitic. Typically, this would present with stiffness and slow movements that affected the arms more than the legs. And unlike other forms of Parkinson's, patients frequently displayed rigidity one moment and then were perfectly mobile the next. This could generally be triggered by external stimulus, like a ball being thrown, breaking their statuesque stance to catch the ball, but then becoming stiff again. As I mentioned a minute ago, one of the symptoms was abnormal eye movements. This is known as oculogyric crisis. During the height of the epidemic, this tormented 15 to 20% of patients and about 30% of those experiencing chronic conditions. Now, to give you an idea of how agonizing this is, during an episode, a patient's eyes would involuntarily move up and could persist for seconds to hours. Mind you, they would be conscious this entire time and could only momentarily move their eyes back down with extreme effort. However, the frequency of episodes varied by patients and could sometimes be invoked by emotions. There were other psychiatric manifestations besides Parkinsonism, including changes in mood, feelings of euphoria, increased sex drive, hallucinations, and some more fun ones like excessive puns, joviality, and silliness. Being a silly goober was a potential symptom. Psychosis was present in about 30% of patients, though milder disorders were very common. Mental changes were much more pronounced in children than in adults. I'm about to go over some potentially sensitive material, including self-mutilation, to explain the evolution of mental changes in patients during the chronic phase of EL. If you want to skip this section, jump to this timestamp. Those between 5 and 10 may only exhibit qualities similar to attention deficit disorders, but as they grow, so does their impulsiveness and violence. They display more cruelty towards those who cross them, destructiveness, lying, and self-mutilation. In one extreme case, an 8-year-old girl removed all of her teeth and both of her eyes. In adolescence, patients manifested inappropriate and excessive sexuality to the point of SA on anyone of any gender or age. Thievery was fairly common, though not for personal gain, as the stolen items were often immediately given away or just thrown out. Patients often recognized their actions were wrong, but they were too compelled to stop. Some improved after adolescence, though many only stopped after developing post-encephalitic Parkinsonism. Those who didn't often went on to live a life full of crime. In men, theft was most common. In women, it was prostitution. However, it could go as far as rape and murder. For those who did develop Parkinsonism, they lost all willpower and sympathy. It seemed even if they were able to move, they couldn't mentally push themselves to. Mind you, their mind remained active, so essentially they were trapped in their own body, made a spectator to their own life. However, they weren't overly depressed by this, as they were also apathetic to their own situation. As the Spanish flu was happening around the same time as the start of the sleeping epidemic, you might have guessed that influenza might be the cause of encephalitis lethargica. At the time, von Economo also believed this might be the case, especially as flu-like symptoms were the first that patients experienced. When he studied the brains of dead patients, he concluded that an infectious virus was the cause of EL. Thus, he and other clinicians proposed that influenza might predispose a person to infection with EL, possibly by affecting mucous membranes in the nose, allowing the encephalitis virus to enter more easily. Plus, it could gain a convenient explanation for the rapid disappearance of EL, as the influenza strains that caused the 1918 pandemic ceased human circulation sometime before 1933. However, the majority of further studies refute the virus hypothesis, And just as many cases point to EL being contagious as point to it not being. One paper, Dale R.C. et al., published in 2004, proposed that EL may be a pediatric autoimmune neuropsychiatric disorder associated with streptococcal infection, or Panda's disease. However, a third of patients seemingly had no history of strep infection, and although most of the patients were fairly young, to qualify as pandas, they couldn't be over 35, yet there were many. And the biggest hurdle for this hypothesis is that pandas isn't a recognized diagnosis in major medical journals. 5 years later, the strep hypothesis was rescinded. Instead, they presented the potential that the hyperkinetic form was an autoimmune disorder caused by antibodies against NMDA receptors. Anti-NMDA receptor encephalitis is an autoimmune encephalitis that is commonly associated with ovarian tumors in young women, but it bears a striking resemblance to EL in symptomology, and also often begins with influenza-like symptoms. Another sleep disorder, narcolepsy, has similarly been found to result from autoimmune reactions. During the 2009 H1N1 influenza pandemic, several European countries reported an increase in cases of narcolepsy following influenza vaccinations and infections. Ultimately, after a century since the epidemic period, there is no known cause for encephalitis lethargica. Thus, it's difficult to diagnose it, basically only after exhausting all other possibilities. Okay, let's take a quick aside to examine some historical figures that some believe might have had encephalitis lethargica. Of course, Hitler might be the most retroactively diagnosed person in history, but he might have gotten EL while recovering from poison gas in a hospital in 1918 at age 29, then possibly developing Parkinsonism in 1934 at 45 years old. Although the EL connection is loose, basically he was in the right place at the right time, many professionals believe that Hitler's expression and possible symptoms are related to Parkinson's, and some believe those symptoms correlate more with post-encephalitic Parkinsonism. This would explain his oculogeric crisis, spasms, and speech and sleep disorders. Plus, EL could explain his asocial behavior, obsessions, compulsions, cruelty, and rage. There is speculation that President Woodrow Wilson also had EL. There is significant evidence that he had been infected with influenza at the Paris Peace Conference, but there is little evidence of EL. Mostly, this is to explain possible post-encephalitic Parkinsonism and his abrupt change in demeanor during the treaty negotiations. During the epidemic period, about 80 different treatments were used. But as you can imagine, without knowing the cause, none of them were particularly effective at treating acute EL. There were few treatments for Parkinsonism during and after the epidemic period. Prior to the 1960s, the most effective treatments were medications that blocked neurotransmitters. In the 1960s, Oliver Sacks used an experimental Parkinsonism medication called L-Dopa, or levodopa, to treat post-encephalitic Parkinsonism. L-Dopa is a precursor to dopamine, which is deficient in Parkinson's patients. The initial reaction was so successful that Sacks described patients as extinct volcanoes that erupted into life after they had long been regarded and even regarded themselves as effectively dead. Unfortunately, most patients began to experience adverse effects like tics, involuntary movement, and emotional instability with only a few months on the drug. Side effects could be so bad that some had to be sedated and others requested to be taken off of it. These trials were later written about by Sacks in his book Awakenings, which was later made into a movie of the same title in 1990. For some good news to round this out, a more recent patient who had become tolerant to L-Dopa was successfully treated with deep brain stimulation. Although there are still cases of encephalitis lethargica today, you can take peace in it being extremely rare. However, with no known cause, there is no stopping another outbreak of sleeping sickness from happening. Thank you for watching to the end. Let me know in the comments what you think of this mystery. If you enjoyed today's video, please like, subscribe, and try out my previous video about a doomsday cult. See you next time.